If we come now to look at the innovation successes that should be stressed with regards to UDL implementation in the last, let's say, 5 years, there are certain areas of growth which are monumental and will be very pertinent to any faculty who are examining or contemplating the possibility of integrating UDL in their practice. So first of all, UDL now has exploded well beyond impairment and disability, although it was originally grounded in this area and this field and this scholarship. It has now gone well beyond, but only recently in the last few years. But now the scholarship is definitely emerging and solid. So of noted interest, particularly in Canada, there's work around universal design and the creation of inclusive provisions for Indigenous students, particularly within the Truth and Reconciliation Commission recommendations, and creating an overlap there and seeing UDL as being aligned with this. There's also increasingly work around the use of UDL to create inclusive provisions for international students. This is very important because now on most North American campuses we have in excess of 25% often of students who are coming from overseas and experiencing considerable barriers in the teaching and learning format, and therefore UDL can be very useful there as well. First generation students as well. There's some emerging, more sporadic there, but emerging literature looking at first generation students, particularly in North America. It's located at community college level. In community colleges, maybe have moved, which would be the equivalent of further education colleges in Ireland, have moved faster sometimes than universities. And often the thing that has really motivated them towards moving has been towards UDL implementation, has been the fact that they are confronted with demographics of learners who are seen as non-traditional. Though really, I put a quote there, I really dislike that term, but for the sake of expediency. And they particularly are confronted with an age range in learners that is far greater than in a university. They have therefore tried to integrate principles of andragogy and looked at how pedagogy should be, go beyond one size fits all. And this is obviously connected to some very interesting overlaps with universal design for learning. I also note culturally diverse learners, and there's particularly a growing body, and in the references you'll find an article by Kieran, I think 2019, which creates an explicit overlap between culturally responsive pedagogy and UDL. And that's an important bridge there that needs to happen in terms of conceptual connections. So those are all areas of great growth. Now we're still waiting to see some literature emerge around LGBTQ2S+ learners and UDL. I would say also that socioeconomically challenged students are not discussed enough in the UDL literature. And in 2020, very recently, after the Black Lives Matter, there is beginning to be more work done around racialized learners and UDL. But I would say that those are initiatives that are happening in the field, but have not been reported in the literature as of yet. Another area of growth and of celebration is the now relevance of UDL within graduate education. I mean, I think for quite a while, there has been a myth that graduate education wasn't really a field where inclusion was particularly difficult or UDL was particularly relevant or necessary, because the myths went along these lines. The population is homogeneous, much more homogeneous than undergraduates. They are students, it's a selective environment, so usually students, by the time they arrive in graduate education, have developed strategies that enable them to successfully navigate the institution. That there are fewer students with disabilities, and that the one-on-one relationship between faculty and student is so much easier, because often either the class size in graduate education are very small, or then we're even talking of supervision, one-on-one supervision. So for all of these arguments, there has been so far a resistance around discussions, deep and rich discussions around inclusion in graduate education, and particularly around the implementation of UDL. This has changed, and actually I think it's really important to debunk those myths. Homogeneous population, no, it's not. The facts actually show us that it's probably even more diverse than the undergrad population. The reason for that is because there's a higher representation of international students within graduate education, and therefore they are experiencing barriers and require, in the implementation of UDL. The relationship, the close relationship, the supposed close relationship between instructor and students, that's not what the literature evidence is, and actually there's quite a large body of literature around the tension that can exist in one-on-one relationships. So UDL would be very useful in these interactions as well. There's an equivalent amount of students with disabilities in graduate education, and it's really the same as an undergraduate, and that's shown in the literature too. Maybe they are less likely to disclose, and maybe more fearful of disclosing and asking for accommodations, but they are present, just as present in undergraduate education. So the myths are debunked. We do have inclusion issues in graduate education. We do require the use of UDL in graduate education, and I'm hoping that the early emerging literature that's coming out in this field will be sort of bumped up by more in-depth research. Another point to celebrate is the rich reflection around UDL and assessment. I would say that out of the three principles within higher education, multiple means of the three principles of UDL, multiple means of representation, multiple means of action and expression are probably the ones that are most explored and taken seriously. Multiple means of engagement, I think faculty are very quick to say that they have reflected about engagement. They didn't wait for UDL to emerge before they started thinking about engagement. I think that can be queried, and that sometimes the way faculty reflect on learner engagement or their construction of learner engagement is particularly teacher-centric and would require a reflection around design thinking in UDL, but let's leave that alone for the moment because this is still an area that it needs to be developed. But in terms of successes, the application of the multiple means of representation principle is suddenly visible in a greater access to alternative formats, use of LMSs, and of integration of electronic resources. That's certainly increased and has been guided by UDL as a set of values. The one that's really interesting is the second principle, multiple means of action and expression. This is really the principle that normally comes into play when we talk about assessment. And my own views is that reflection around assessment and UDL in higher education has been promising and it's starting to be quite abundant. And that also is probably connected to now the COVID crisis, and I'll come back to that at the end of the section. There's certainly some interesting work by Tobin in particular, but a lot of different scholars in different contexts that have primarily focused on assessment as an area for reflection around UDL, and that's been very noticeable in the last 5 years. A growing interest is also noticed in terms of UDL being explored and discussed in new sets of disciplines, and by this I mean that we have had traditionally UDL exploration in the last 10 years happening in lecture hall, and primarily with regards to humanities, social sciences, and sciences. And when it's sciences, it has tended to be undergraduate large lectures or large size courses. This is changing, and there's now a really interesting questioning around what might UDL look like in a science lab, in a foreign language class, in a art studio. I've done some interesting work around an arts college. I was looking at what UDL might look like in studio critique. There's also interesting work being done at those experiential opportunities. So that might be within any course, but whenever they contain or include an experiential chapter, which many courses do now, or many programs, then there's some interest in UDL there as well. And then obviously physical education is an area where there's actually a lot of work being done around UDL, and that there's a natural connection there because obviously universal design itself has been very closely linked to physiotherapy, to sports, And so that connection has existed all the time, but that literature has grown as well. So this is interesting, and we hope really that in the next few years we'll see more literature that sets precedents about UDL implementation and reflection in the full spectrum of the teaching spaces and contexts in which we operate. I had the privilege of editing a book, which will come out at the end of March, beginning of April, which considers case studies in higher education and the implementation of UDL. Within that, there's certainly within that book a few chapters on social work, on the language classroom, on the very large classrooms as well in science, which is yet another, the sort of mega classes, and other sort of interesting articles. So I encourage you to consult that as well. One thing that is occurring as well now, and starting something very relevant to me, because there's a chapter which I produced in 2019, which I cite in the references. I think we're starting to see to reflect on the way we position UDL and to be very careful to make sure it's not presented as something new and out of the box, but as something which places itself in a historical continuum of pedagogical theory and reflection. So it is, I think, very important that we don't see UDL as something completely new, but in fact that we explicitly and expressly stress to faculty that actually there are very direct connections between UDL and constructivism, UDL and social constructivism, UDL and experiential learning, and mostly, particularly when it comes to multiple means of engagement, to connections, overlap, and bridges, to conceptual bridges, to critical pedagogy. I think that is really, really useful because it's, first of all, as I've said previously in the presentation, it sort of reduces the resistance of faculty if they have the feeling that this is actually something which really repackages to a degree existing theory, and therefore is not something new, but something very based on long existing sort of approaching to the classroom. And also, I think it avoids the great danger that we have in higher education where we function in silos. So it would be really regrettable if UDL was seen, and it is sometimes seen, as something that has its own jargon and is a bit of a cult. I've heard that word before. So it's important to address that full on and to debunk that myth, and to all of us to explicitly create those connections between UDL and other school of thoughts. I think it would be regrettable if people, for example, entered the higher education classroom and looked at transformation pedagogy using solely UDL. I very often will be using simultaneously notions of constructivism and notions of UDL. I've written recently a chapter on active blended learning and its overlap with UDL as well. So I think it's all of our responsibilities as scholars to connect explicitly UDL with existing theory. It doesn't have a reason to exist in a vacuum. It exists in a theoretical landscape, and it's very important that we accentuate this theoretical landscape and these explicit connections, because that is what makes it palatable. That is what is actually going to attract faculty towards the model. Lastly, in this section, I want to talk about the impact of COVID-19. Although there's emerging literature on COVID-19 and the impact on higher education, it's still very early days to know whether what the actual impact will be long term in the post-pandemic higher education landscape. There are certainly people falling on both sides of the fence, people saying that it has been very beneficial in the sense that it has created important discussions around teaching and learning in higher education. Other people fall on the other side of the fence and says that actually it's created such exhaustion and resistance that we may actually see the pendulum swing, and we may actually find faculty being much more resistant to using technology, to being online, to reflecting richly about learning engagement online. And that we may actually find people returning to, values and mindsets from 20 years ago. Obviously, both are possible. I'm rather hopeful, and I have a feeling that being confronted with an online pivot for a whole year has forced a lot of instructors to reconsider the existing construct of certain values, particularly when it comes to engagement, for example, and particularly when it comes to assessment. And we've seen, for example, in North America, a whole debacle of faculties and instructors seeking to assess students in the same way as they did before, so pretty much rote learning and regurgitation. That obviously happening has led to possible possibilities of cheating, and that has led to other fiascos concerning external proctoring and software to sort of detect cheating. I think there's a healthy sort of reaction to that that's emerging 6 months, 9 months later, which is a scenario where we finally see instructors who use these traditional modes of assessment starting to understand that maybe the problem is not that the student is online and at home. Maybe the problem is not the fact that there's a window for cheating, but that simply what was being assessed isn't possibly the essential, and that assessment can be creative and can be formatted in a way that prevents cheating because it requires authentic and analytical thought. And then once you do that shift, you really don't mind at all where the student is and whether they are online or even whether they're surrounded by people. And I think UDL has helped there move that reflection along. So I would say, although there's a big question mark around the post-pandemic higher education landscape and what we'll be inheriting, I am hopeful that UDL now has positioned itself much more solidly at the center of these considerations, and that it will come out in the post-pandemic landscape as a much stronger lens that faculty use in addressing some of the challenges which they faced during the pandemic.